Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. Hi, I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. This evening's edition will host Legislative Issues with Jim Parisi, where we bring the legislature into your living room. We hope you enjoy this edition of Legislative Issues and Labor Vision. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly right into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm also your host this evening. As we begin a new legislative year, Labor Vision is going to bring in different senators and representatives to talk about different issues important to working people. And today, one of the first shows we're taping this session, we're pleased to have Representative Jay O'Grady with us. Representative, thanks for joining us.
Jim, my pleasure.
So you represent District 46. You are on several different committees, the Corporations Committee, Judiciary, as well as the Committee on the Environment.
Yes. Pleased to represent District 46 and pleased to be on each of those committees as well.
Sure. 46 is all within the town of Lincoln?
So the district is about 90% Lincoln, and then about 10% of the district is Pawtucket as well. So Lincoln is a community that I've represented in one form or another for the past going on 10 years now. I first ran for town council back in 2004. And then was on the town's budget board, which reports out to our financial town meeting, and have been honored to serve as a representative in the General Assembly for the last, going on my third term now.
Sure. So you were elected in 2010, and I know we had you on the show a couple of years ago talking about a few different mass transit issues. How did some of that work out?
Well, actually, last session saw some, I think, tremendous progress on addressing both our mass transit system in terms of RIPTA and the Ride program, which is the American with Disability component of that. But also we saw some progress in addressing our backlog of infrastructure needs as well. And I've always said that unless we can have quality infrastructure that allows the state of Rhode Island to leverage its proximity to the larger markets of New York and Boston, we're going to have a difficulty attracting companies to come here, particularly when there are other states that are between Boston and New York that might have better infrastructure. In Connecticut, I'm speaking of specifically. So last year we were able to get some dedicated funding for transportation, both the infrastructure piece and the mass transit piece. It was years in the making, and I'm pretty happy with the results. Yeah,
we had Fuzzy Harrington of the Transit Union in on the show talking about the bond issue last fall, and really outlining some important steps we need to make to have our infrastructure in place so that we can adapt and grow as an urban core where people are working. Because people talk about jobs all the time, but if you can't get people to the job locations, there's going to be a problem.
Yeah, no, exactly, and you've reminded me about the bond piece as well. I wasn't even referring to that. I was referring to the transportation budget article last year that addressed both those issues, and it was nice to see that the bond received such overwhelming support from the voters as well, which indicates to me that transportation is not something that is only the concern of policymakers in the General Assembly, but is also a deeply held concern of the electorate. So that was nice to see.
It sure was. So there are many bills that pass the Assembly that create study commissions, and sometimes the commissions meet, sometimes they don't. But you're the sponsor of a study commission bill that you're taking very seriously, and in fact, the bill that passed last session has already led to some meetings of a study commission this year. Why don't you take a few minutes and let us know what the Fair Funding Formula Study Commission is taking a look at?
Sure. Well, as you know, back in 2010, the state of Rhode Island passed a very comprehensive piece of legislation that established for the first time in many years a formula, a predictable formula through which education at the elementary and secondary levels were funded. And it essentially looked at student population. It looked at what percentage of that population met qualifications for free and reduced lunch, which were proxies for need. It looked at community wealth and the ability of communities to fund their own education systems through property taxes. And it essentially determined on a go-forward basis what sort of state support there should be for each municipality's education spend. And then, the rest of the money required to educate a child would then be on the taxpayers of the individual communities to fund. So in Lincoln's case, it was determined that Lincoln can support about 60% of its own education budget, and the state should step in and fund 40% of that budget based on this assessment of need and a population assessment. Prior to the implementation of that funding formula, Lincoln was at the mercy sounds dramatic, but really at the whim of the General Assembly to decide what funding should come to the town or not. And every other town in the state was in that same position. So it was difficult to budget for education, particularly when the General Assembly's final budget doesn't really come out until many municipalities have already established their budgets for the next year. So the fair funding formula was the result of years of work, is my understanding, and was adopted again back in the 2010 session. And like any major piece of legislation, it is really to the benefit of taxpayers and citizens to have the General Assembly take a look at how the implementation of that has gone several years down the road, to see whether or not there are any unintended consequences that we're seeing now through that implementation, and if so, to address them.
I know some of the issues that arose right when the funding formula was being adopted was a concern of some communities that were deemed the losers. We had winners and losers, right? Communities that would get more education aid based on the formula and some that would get less. And they phased in the formula. So if you were gaining, you only got 1/7, and if you were losing, that was spread out over a longer period of time. I know that was a pretty hot button issue at the time, and there's been bills put in every year to revisit that issue. Is that something that you're going to spend much time and attention on as part of your study commission?
Well, that is not actually one of the goals of my study commission. And you're right, that the issue that you refer to is a tough one for some communities, South Kingston in particular, and also some of the communities that received essentially a consolidation bonus when districts were regionalized. And that bonus was essentially frozen into place, although it was supposed to be a short-term solution or a short-term incentive. And so districts like Bristol-Warren, for example, really that incentive extended for years, and then when it was eliminated, it's a tough gap to fill, particularly at trying times. And
sure.
I've not been an elected official when times haven't been trying, so that might be a fun experience someday. But yeah, what we're really looking at here is a particular sub-issue of the fair funding formula, and that is the treatment of charter schools vis-a-vis the sending districts. So the way it works now is that when a child in a town, let's say Lincoln, for example, opts to go to a charter school instead of the traditional public school, the town of Lincoln is required, and any municipality would be required to remit to that charter a per pupil share of its locally supported expenditure, in addition to its entire per pupil share of the state supported expenditure. And the idea, said sort of in a compelling way at the time, was that the funding should follow the child, and that's sort of how it's been explained, that the funding follows the child to a charter school, to the Met, to Davies, where have you.
The Met and the Davies being state schools as opposed to charters, which we actually have 3 different kinds. We have 3 district-affiliated charter schools. All the teachers are members of the bargaining unit in both Providence and Cranston.
Yep.
Then we have a host of independent charter schools, and then we have a third group, which is the Merrill Academies, which is the most recent form of charter schools in Rhode Island.
Correct. And so the implication, when you say the funding follows the child, the implication there is that expenses follow the child as well. So that if you have a set group of funding that supports the education of a child, and that child leaves your school, then in theory the expenses that are associated with that child would equal the loss of revenue when the funding follows that child. But it had been explained to me by constituents, by folks on our school committee, by our superintendent, as well as others around the state, that was not in fact the case. That most of the charges, or a significant portion of the charges that are associated with children, are in the form of fixed costs. So these are costs for transportation, for facilities, for sports, enrichment, things like that, which do not actually follow the child, but stay behind in the school district to be shouldered by perhaps a decreasing number of kids whose revenue is staying in the school system. So it becomes a structural issue moving forward. So I always give the example. I have a daughter that goes to, well, I have two children actually that go to Salesville Elementary School. Mm-hmm. So if someone left my daughter's fourth grade class for a charter option, the town of Lincoln would essentially remit about $14,000 to that charter of local spend, and then in addition to that, whatever state support is associated with that child would also go to the charter. But you can bet that it does not suddenly cost $14,000 plus less to operate that fourth grade class, mm-hmm. due to the removal of that one child. Teacher still has to be paid. There are legacy costs that still have to be dealt with. The school still has to be heated. The buses still have to run, et cetera, et cetera. So when you start to multiply that by hundreds of times, or in the case of Pawtucket, 1,500 times, you start to have a big gap between the tuition that's been remitted and the savings attributable to the removal of those children, whatever that number might be.
I could see this being a really detailed issue that your study commission's working on. First of all, who's on the study commission? It includes a broad representation of stakeholders, but let our viewers know, who's composed of.
Sure. Well, I think we went out of our way to make sure we had as broad a group of stakeholders as possible. So we have representatives from the League of Cities and Towns. We have a representative from the Rhode Island Superintendents Association. Representative from the Rhode Island School Committees Association. We have representatives from Rhode Island Mayoral Academies, from the League of Charter Schools. We have a representative from the Met. We have a representative from NEA. We have a representative from AFT. And there are 3 House members in addition to that, myself, Greg Amore, and Justin Price. So it is a broad base, but I think we're all interested in making sure that whatever unforeseen consequences there were from the implementation of the fair funding formula, that we can address them now, at least vet them now, and hopefully suggest, if necessary, some revisions to that formula so that our school systems remain strong and stable moving forward.
So what are the different areas of inquiry that your study commission is going to have?
Sure. Well, we've broken it down into 4 subtasks. So the first is the one that I was getting at a moment ago. It's looking at the average cost versus marginal savings issue. So again, when a child goes to a charter school, their tuition is the average per pupil cost that their local district spends. And that is what's remitted to the charter, versus the marginal savings that result from the removal of that child from the traditional school system. So just to give an example, the town of Cumberland ran an analysis where they looked at the 168 students that are K through K through 8 charter students. And they looked at what the cost would be to reabsorb those 168 children back into the Cumberland school system. And they did it very specifically. They did it by individual. So they looked at, where does this child live? So therefore, which elementary school specifically would they need to go to? Which middle school, if they were old enough,
would they need to hire more teachers, for example?
Would they need to hire more teachers? What class would they go into? And would the addition of that child cause a contract overage clause to come into an effect? Mm-hmm. And if so, how much? Transportation, books, all of that. And what they determined was that it would cost the town of Cumberland roughly $460,000 to reabsorb the 168 K through 8 charter students that are currently going out of the district at an expense of about $2.1 million in tuition. So, Cumberland has exposed, just on their K through 8 charter students, what they believe is about a $1.6 million differential between your average cost versus marginal savings.
I know there's a lot of contributing factors to that, but one of them is the costs vary to educate an elementary student versus a secondary student, for example, where you need more teachers when you have more course offerings in middle schools and high schools, and I imagine that kind of detail is one of the many things that you're going to be taking a look at then.
Yeah, for sure, and that sort of plays into subtasks 2 and 3. Just to stick on subtask 1 for a moment, we've had probably 7 or 8 school districts at this point have run that sort of reabsorption analysis, and in fact they've all been asked to, and they're returning similar numbers. So Lincoln has almost the exact experience that Cumberland had, with about $2 million of tuitions and about 400,000, little more, to reabsorb those students that have gone. So, and we're seeing those numbers play out, whether it's Charahoe or North Kingstown or North Smithfield or Coventry or wherever. We're seeing the same trend. Second, what we want to look at is getting at some of the things that you're talking about. There are some, at least from the population numbers that I've seen and the census numbers that have been reported by Rhode, there are some disparities between the sending districts and the receiving charters with regard to special ed population. According to the Special Education Expenditure Project out of Washington, it costs about 1.91 times more to educate a special education child or a child that is characterized as having one of the 13 special ed diagnoses than it does a regular ed child. So if we are seeing great disparities in special ed population in the sending districts versus special ed populations at the charters, then the charters are getting an enhanced number because the local share, the local spend that they get a piece of, is inflated by special ed costs borne by the local districts but not borne by the charter. So if you look at Blackstone Valley Prep, for example, they have a reported special ed population of about 9%. They pull from Lincoln at 18%, Cumberland at 18%, Central Falls at 20%, and Pawtucket at 19%. So there seems to be a disparity there, and we're going to look at that in subtask 2.
We don't have a whole lot of time left, so I don't want to neglect the future agenda. So what's subtask 3 and subtask 4 looking like?
I'll get right into those. So there are some costs that it's been at least purported that there are some costs that are borne by the local districts that get factored into their local spend number that charters get a piece of when a child attends them, but that charters will never have the obligation to fund themselves. And so a classic example of this would be early education or early intervention services for at-risk 3 to 5-year-olds. Local districts are obligated to provide those services. They work their way into the local spend number, which charters get a piece of, but charters never provide, or at least it's been reported to us, that charters do not provide early education services themselves. The same thing would apply for post-graduation 18 to 21-year-old young adults with developmental disabilities. There are support services that are provided through the budgets of the school districts. Charters get a piece of that number, but again, it's been reported to us that they don't provide those type of services. So we want to look at that in subtask 3. And then finally in subtask 4, we want to look at the extent to which there is oversight and transparency. I would say that folks who are supportive of charters refer to them as public schools of choice. And again, the implication is that there is oversight and transparency when you use the word public. Certainly I know that the Lincoln school system, they fight for every dollar, every dime even, before our financial town meeting each year. And before they even get there, they do it before their school committee and town administrator and budget board. It seems to us that it should be looked at to see what kind of fights folks on the charter side have.
Sure. So I feel like we've just touched on this, the tip of the iceberg, if you will, but I understood this to be a complicated issue, and I appreciate you at least giving an overview of what you're going to be looking at.
Sure.
Your study commission is meeting regularly on Fridays, and it's on Capitol TV for those who want to tune in, correct?
And Capitol TV on demand for those who are up late at night, yes.
Well, Representative, I thank you for your time. I thank you for your leadership on this issue, and I look forward to maybe having you or some of your colleagues back in the studio later this session so you can talk about what the study commission found in terms of both factual findings as well as recommendations.
Sure. Sounds great. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for your time. Thank you. And thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision.
We've heard from many advocates of raising the tip minimum wage, but now let's hear from one of the workers. I'd like to introduce Kate Conroy.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm a 31-year-old mother and a bartender and server with over 10 years of experience in the city of Providence. The subminimum wage is not a livable wage. It's a poverty wage. Tipped workers, like myself, are more likely to live in poverty and much more likely to be women. Subminimum wage workers, like me, do have families. The cost of living in this city rises, but our pay doesn't, and it hasn't in 20 years. Unpredictable wages have many invisible problems. It's much harder to get credit, and it's hard to get an apartment when you don't show reliable income. And there's lots of unpredictability. The managers whose whim it is which shifts you will get. Maybe it's the same superior whose managerial work you might be doing for free. Or the unpredictable weather around here. When it snows or storms, how do you pay a babysitter that day? How much work will you do when you're not making tips, but maybe you're cleaning or managing for $2.89 an hour? Raising the subminimum wage would lift not only service workers out of poverty, but it would empower people raising families like myself and living in a city that's so proud of its hospitality industry to participate in the economy. I think that it's time that professional servers, bartenders, and other workers laboring for $2.89 an hour to finally get a raise. Thank you.
Again, it's always important to note that when a worker steps up to speak, they're facing retaliation and they can be facing new harassment. It takes a unique courage of the people to stand up sometimes. So with that, I'd like to invite Jen Steinfeld to come speak.
Hi, I'm Jen Steinfeld, and I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Fund of Rhode Island. And as many people have already mentioned today, this is a women's issue, with nearly 3 in 4 of the tipped workers in the state of Rhode Island being women. With many of them being mothers, this is a childhood poverty issue, and frankly, it's a social justice issue as well. So we are here because we don't want to see anything happen to women who want to speak up on behalf of their own wages. We want to lend our voice to this coalition in support of an increase to the tip minimum wage. We believe that this is a way to level the playing field for women in our state. And we know that from other states that have eliminated the subminimum wage, The gender wage gap has also declined. So we're strong supporters of this coalition, and we're happy to be part of the One Fair Wage Coalition. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Again, it's advocates that come forward that do so much, but it's also the workers that this is about. So I'd like to invite a fine dining server and a very, very courageous man, Joe Fortune, to speak to the issue.
Thank you for everyone that showed up today. It is a real honor to have the opportunity to speak. As a server, I usually just listen, but my mother, as a single mother, raised myself and my brother while working at Hemingway's and Spats when I was a kid, so she kind of taught me everything I needed to know about working hard in the restaurant industry. But my goal here is really to dispel the myth that people that work in fine dining are just making a killing and saving money and all that kind of stuff. I mean, just because someone has a big table one time, that means they probably also had another shift where they might not have made minimum wage that day. And I would say if you really looked at what servers in fine dining make, even the best ones sometimes go home without making minimum wage that day. And most of them are mothers and fathers and things like that. I just wanted to dispel the myth that we're not all college kids just making some extra allowance or something. It's people raising families, and we should get at least minimum wage at the end of the day. Thank you.
Again, the value of this is going to be lifting people out of poverty. This is really a jobs program. This is really a way to step forward in a state where we're leaving people behind. Again, the business community is on board with us, and I'd like to ask Asher Schofield to come forward and speak.
I'd like to thank you all for being here and thank Representative Regenberg and Representative Golden for putting this conversation out there for us all to have. My name is Asher Schofield. I've owned and operated a business in Providence for 14 years. I also co-founded the Hope Street Merchants Association 9 years ago. And I just wanted to speak about my feelings on the topic of raising the minimum wage for tipped workers. I think this is going to be good for business. For me, I'm a business that is dependent on people having money, having capital in their pockets to spend and to support their local economy in this fashion. I can see a substantial increase in the tipped workers minimum wage affecting my business's fourth quarter significantly, and other businesses as well. So I think that just to counter any potential arguments about this having a negative impact on businesses, I see this as being very positive. I think this is a very serious issue that we're here to address today. I'm really glad that we're having this conversation and that we're hearing from these brave people who are able to speak up and support this, and I'm proud to be able to do that as well.
Every wage increase that's happened historically has always been treated as if the sky was going to fall, but the reality was that it was a rising tide that lifted every boat. We need to make sure that all of the workers of Rhode Island are included in our recovery and included in the growth, and that's why I'm urging everyone to support the One Fair Wage Coalition. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m. Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. Hi, I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. This evening's edition will host Legislative Issues with Jim Parisi, where we bring the legislature into your living room. We hope you enjoy this edition of Legislative Issues and Labor Vision.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly right into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm going to be your host this evening. In the previous couple of shows of legislative issues, we had a conversation with George Nee about the progress we made in the 2014 year, as well as the initiatives that the AFL-CIO and the labor movement were going to take for the 2015 session. We continue with that with another person from the labor movement, Pat Crowley. Pat, thanks for joining us.
Jim, thanks for having me.
Pat, you work for the National Education Association of Rhode Island. Why don't you start by telling our viewers who belongs to your organization?
Sure. NEA Rhode Island is one of the largest unions in the state of Rhode Island, along with our colleagues in the Federation of Teachers. We represent about 12,000 active and retired members in the state. We have classroom teachers and education support professionals throughout the state, but we also represent professional workers and faculty members at CCRI, professional staff at the University of Rhode Island, faculty and workers at some private universities and colleges in the state, but we also represent people at the municipal level and really throughout the state of Rhode Island at various levels of public service and education work in Rhode Island.
And while it's not a legislative issue, you also had a new organization join you folks last year.
Yeah, we had a very large organizing drive with the adjunct faculty at the Community College of Rhode Island. Just under 500 people voted to join NEA last April. It was one of the largest organizing wins in the country last year, and it was, really exciting to have that big of a group join.
Yeah, well, that's terrific. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And your commitment to organizing is real important for the vitality of the labor movement in the future.
Thanks. It was a team effort, by the way. I mean, your organization, our friends in the UFCW and the AFL-CIO, everyone pitched in to make this happen.
So let's take a few minutes and talk about last year, because my thinking is last year was a pretty good year for teachers and other public sector workers.
Yeah, the best part about last year with the legislative session was a real refocusing on the rights and the role of education from the ground up. I mean, really starting with the students and what they have to do as students in their role as learning, and what the General Assembly can do with them, with the focus on high-stakes testing as a graduation requirement. I'll be quite honest with you, the teacher labor movement was late to the game on this in Rhode Island, and we learned from our friends in the Providence Student Union about how important it would be to make sure that we put a moratorium on the use of high-stakes testing as a graduation requirement. We were always focused on testing and what it did to students, and the pressure and the anxiety that it could face. But it was a pleasure to work with such an excellent group of advocates in the Providence Student Union to put pressure on all of the grown-ups in the room, including the legislators, including the teachers, including people in the other advocacy communities, to say, yeah, that's great that you understand it, but take action. It's important to make sure that the kids and students have the right and the opportunity and the time to learn, and that's not going to happen unless the state stops forcing these tests, these kneecap tests that we've talked about over the last few years, and using them as a graduation requirement. And because of their leadership, we were able to make sure that until 2017, according to the law at least, there won't be a high-stakes graduation requirement. And I think that was a tremendous victory for everyone involved in education.
And who carried the ball on those issues in the House and in the Senate?
On the House side, it was Representative Greg Amore, who's a teacher in East Providence, at the end to make sure that we carry that, as well as really the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader, Speaker Mattiello and Leader DeSimone, who made sure that at the end we made that this carried the day. And in the Senate side, to make sure that it was the Senate President wanted to really make sure that this became a priority, as well as the people that focus on education on the Senate side, Senator Gallo, Senator Sheehan, why am I blanking on the other?
Senator Adam Satchel.
Senator Adam Satchel, I'm sorry, Senator Satchel. But the people that really care about these issues, that want to make sure that the students in particular that raised the alarm on this, to make sure that we pass this important piece of legislation.
And how about the teacher evaluation bill? That was another high-profile bill that got a lot of focus and attention.
Absolutely, and Representative O'Brien from North Providence, really led the charge on this on the House of Representatives side to put a focus on this. Teachers for the last several years have been raising a lot of concerns about the burdens that have been placed on them directly in the classroom, on the time it takes to go through a really onerous evaluation system that doesn't produce the results that I think the bureaucrats intended it to produce. A lot of data collection that gets really shoved in a drawer at the end of the day. And while there may be some merit to having an evaluation system in place, what's in place right now doesn't necessarily get the results that it's maybe intended to. What Rep. O'Brien pushed for and what was eventually enacted was a cyclical system, so that teachers that are highly effective, rated at, that are demonstrating that they're doing their jobs effectively and even highly effectively, don't have to go through this evaluation system on an annual basis and can do their jobs working with kids every single day. It doesn't mean that they don't have to talk with their principal, don't have to talk with their colleagues, don't have to talk with anyone else in the education system to say if maybe there's some improvements or changes in their practice that come along that they have to learn about. It's not like you can disappear and shut the classroom door for 4 years. But what it means is that teachers will have the time to learn and do their jobs. And those teachers who do need a little bit extra help, a little bit of review on their practice, as we call it in our field, they'll still be able to get their help, and they'll be able to focus on where they can improve their jobs. I mean, I really think it's a win-win for everyone involved, but most importantly, the system that we're here to help with, the students that are here in Rhode Island to learn.
Because the legislation provides that new teachers, the non-tenured teachers who change jobs with the change in certification, those folks are still going to get their evaluations this year.
Right, absolutely. I mean, when you get into the nuts and bolts of the legislation, the concerns that people had about who's going to be evaluated, who's not, the sponsor of the bill, Rep. O'Brien, worked with all the advocates in the community to say, let's make sure this works, because we want to demonstrate that it's not about this policy or that policy. It's about finding an evaluation system that benefits, the system.
Yeah. Well, and one last thought on that: the legislation by Rep. O'Brien and Senator Goodwin, like the bills on standardized tests, really passed with overwhelming margins, didn't they?
They really did, and I think that shows that teachers' voices, students' voices, parents' voices were really heard loud and clear last year by the General Assembly. And that's refreshing.
It sure is. So, we're in 2015. We've got a new legislative session. We have some new faces in the building. We have a new governor. What are you looking at as far as legislative priorities for your members and the people you represent and the programs that your members work in?
So our legislative agenda is going to be focused again on what's in the best interest of kids and learning, and for the state of Rhode Island as a whole. I mean, with our members touching so many different areas of the state, it's funny how many things that we get involved in. Primarily right now in the early stages of the General Assembly session, we're paying particular focus to Representative O'Grady's commission in the House of Representatives, looking at the fair funding formula as it relates to charter school funding and career and technical education. Back when the fair funding formula was established in 2009 and became effective in 2010, there were a lot of statements made that, you know, this is the first step, we'll get this enacted, but we know we have to revisit it in a few years, but that's never really been done. It's well time that we look at what I would call holes in the system as it relates to how charter schools are funded, how career and technical education is funded, just to make sure that what we attempted to do back, 5 years ago now, doesn't starve local communities of needed funding. There's some interesting testimony that's taken place so far, especially in areas in the Blackstone Valley, where I know both of our unions represent local communities, about how the interplay between the funding in the sending communities, schools like Lincoln and Cumberland that send kids to charter schools, the formula isn't working as it was intended maybe. So if that's the case, how do we fix it so that the system doesn't collapse under its own weight? But I know that my members that work at Davies, which was a blue ribbon school, it's doing great work in the career and technical education area, they also have concerns to make sure that the specialized education that they provide, that sometimes is a lot more costly than a traditional high school that you might find that doesn't provide career and tech education, how do they make sure that they're not getting shortchanged by the funding formula?
Sure, and that study commission is meeting already, and do you think that they're going to come up with some recommendations that'll impact this year's education budget?
I sure hope so. I mean, I know that the representatives and the participants on it are, forthright and coming at it with the best attitude. Even if they're not coming at it from the same point of view all the time, I know everyone on that commission is coming at it, with the best intentions.
Sure. So what else is on your agenda?
So what we're really hoping to do is figure out how we can work with people like Senator Gallo in the Senate to make sure that all-day K becomes a reality across the state of Rhode Island. It's one of the things that should just be a no-brainer to make sure that all-day K happens. If we can make sure that all-day K is just considered, universal in Rhode Island, that would be important. So there's that. But also, it doesn't necessarily relate to the Rhode Island General Assembly, but one of the key issues right now that we're working with in Rhode Island goes back to where we started the conversation, is testing. And at the federal level, they're reviewing right now the Elementary Secondary Education Act, which is talking about the high-stakes testing that is required at the state level by the federal government. And we're doing a lot of work with our members looking at what the federal government requires the state of Rhode Island to do for testing in the high-stakes testing level. So our members are actively engaged with Senator Whitehouse's office and talking with their other members of Congress to make sure that when the Senate in particular, but all of the federal Congress, looks at how high-stakes testing impacts kids and teachers in Rhode Island, there's a little bit more of a fair system in place for it. So it's a wide range of issues. And
again, it's an issue that's not just about teachers. That one's about how we educate kids, what students feel, what benefits students, and clearly there's now a backlash against this over-reliance on standardized tests in this country. Absolutely. I mean,
as a parent of a Rhode Island public school kid, and as someone who deals with this not just from a working person's point of view, but as a dad of a kid, going through NECAP last year and now PARC, having to review those documents from a first-hand point of view. I live this stuff every day for work, and I get confused at it when my son brings this stuff home. I can just imagine someone who's not familiar with all these regulations and policies having to navigate this system. Something's got to change.
Sure. So we only have another minute or so left. Any final thoughts on what what you think you're going to be working on this year?
Well, I think, you know, the good thing about Rhode Island and the labor movement that we have is we're such a close-knit community. You know, I'm excited, you know, hearing what Brother Nee was talking about with the economic development plans that we have, you know, starting from the ground up with raising the minimum wage. There's nothing that is a better anti-poverty program than a job that pays a living wage. And 10.10 an hour that I know Representative Bennett has put in co-sponsored by a lot of the new representatives that we got elected last year. That's a great way to start to make sure that, you know, all of us in the labor movement, public sector, private sector, can work on. I'm looking forward to making sure that we get more progress in that this year.
That's terrific. Patrick, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you for coming on the show and telling our viewers you know, what you'll expect yourself and others to be working on this session.
Thanks, Jim.
And thank you for joining us for Labor Vision.
Today is March 19th, and it's going to be a day that everyone remembers. This is Women's History Month, and we're going to try to make history for women here at the Rhode Island State House. Behind me is a coalition made up of labor, community, faith, representatives, and business who all believe that 10% of Rhode Island's population has been left behind and needs to be part of our society in total. Currently, tipped workers are only paid $2.89 an hour. They face rates of discrimination and harassment that is the highest of any industry in the country. They use almost $700,000 worth of food assistance in Rhode Island, and they suffer rates of poverty 1.5 times that of other industries. This is something that a society that cares about people cannot be let happen. Maureen Martin, the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL, always posts at the end of her emails, she says, "It is in the shelter of each other that we all live." This coalition is providing shelter and protection for the women who can be intimidated when they come to speak, who can be too frightened because of retribution, and can be too fragile to actually come forward. So these people behind me are lending their voices. So we're going to go through our speakers really quickly. I would like to invite Representative Teresa Tanzi to come speak to the issue. Oh, I'm sorry. Take that back. I'm going to introduce the bill sponsor, Aaron Regenberg, first, and then Gail Golden in Senate. Thank you.
Hello, as Mike said, my name is Aaron Regenberg, and I want to thank everyone for coming out. I'm very excited to be here today to welcome the many coalition partners who have joined together to say that 20 years is long enough and the time has come to raise Rhode Island's sub-minimum wage. I think it's valuable to start this conversation with a little historical context. In 1996, when I was just 6 years old, the regular minimum wage in Rhode Island was $4.45 an hour, and the tip minimum wage was $2.89 an hour. Today, nearly 20 years later, the regular minimum wage is $9 an hour, and the tip minimum wage is still just $2.89 an hour. That translates into real hardships for a lot of Rhode Islanders who face frequent instability and economic insecurity. According to the most recent Bureau of Labor Statistics report, the average hourly wage, including gratuities, for tipped workers in Rhode Island is $8.90. As Mike said, tipped workers have higher poverty rates and are twice as likely to be on food stamps as non-tipped workers in our state. That's the reality. And that's why Senator Golden and I have introduced legislation in the House and the Senate that would provide a measure of added security to thousands of hardworking Rhode Islanders by gradually raising the sub-minimum wage, starting with a bump to $4.50 in 2016. Now, I could go on, but we have a lot of folks here today who bring a number of diverse perspectives on this issue. So I will pause here to let others discuss why they think it's so critical that the General Assembly pass this legislation. Thanks again.
And with that, we're announcing the formal formation of the One Fair Wage Coalition. Now I'd like to invite Senator Golden to say a few words about it.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here, and it is incredible to see the coalition of people who are joining Representative Regenberg and I in ensuring that some of our lowest wage workers in the state are seeing a raise for the first time in 20 years. When I first learned that we had been raising the minimum wage without also addressing the tip minimum wage, I was a little bit surprised and started researching it. And one of the things that I came across was research from the National Women's Law Center that talked about how this is actually also about the gender wage gap, because we are creating an institutionalized difference in our minimum wage, because so many women make up the majority of tipped workers in our state and across the country. I am delighted that there are people here who are advocating on behalf of tip workers and have come together for the first time really to talk about this issue. I know for myself that I've never once thought that when I was leaving somebody a tip, it was what was going to actually pay their rent or put food in their child's mouth. It was my way of saying thank you for great service. What I think we really need to realize is that when we put more money in people's pockets, our economy keeps going. And this is a way to ensure that more people in the state have more money in their pockets, can buy those groceries, pay rent, and ensure that their kids are well cared for. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to all of our coalition members for joining us.
It's vital that we remember that solidarity is a central principle of everything we do. And with that, George Nee is probably the best expression of that. So I'd love if George Nee came up and said a few words about this.
We are very proud to be a part of this coalition. On behalf of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO, we have been fighting for years to raise the minimum wage. It has been unfortunate that that has not applied to the men and women who work very hard in the hospitality industry and depend on tipped wages. We believe that there is tremendous abuse where people in some cases don't know that they have a right to the minimum wage and should be paid the minimum wage by their employer if they don't make it as a result of the tips. And we are firmly committed that there has to be economic justice and social justice for everybody. This group has essentially worked in the shadows of our economy. It's about time that they are brought out into the sunlight of our economy, and the sun is out today, which is very nice for a change. And we are committed to make sure, again, that in our state, economic justice applies to everybody. So with that, again, we're proud to be part of this coalition, and let's move forward. Thank you.
I'm not really bringing props with me. You know, we've heard from labor and we've heard from reps, but I think it would be helpful if we heard from the business community. So I'd like to invite Andy Posner from the Capital Good Fund to speak a few words about this issue.
Thank you. So I'm the founder and CEO of Capital Good Fund, and we're a nonprofit that does financial services for low-income families, including one-on-one financial and health coaching and small loans. And as such, I think about this in terms of a budget. So when we sit down with a family, and we do this all the time, and we see that they make $2.80 to $2.89 an hour plus tips, we can't do an accurate budget because we don't know how much they're going to bring in. Some weeks they bring in enough, some weeks they don't. And as a result, they have to resort to high-interest loans. They have to resort to pawning their items. They have to resort to going to friends and family or doing without. This isn't just a moral issue, it's an economic one, as has been mentioned before. Our families that we work with don't have savings, they don't have bank accounts, they don't have good credit, and it's because of their financial instability and their lack of a secure income that they can budget. If they know how much they're going to make, they can invest in the local economy, they can invest in themselves, they can invest in their families. So By getting rid of the two-tiered wage system, we can then sit down with families to build budgets that make sense for them, for the families, and for the state. Thank you.
It's important that we make sure that everyone's voice gets heard. So I'd like to invite Meg Fosk of Restaurant Opportunity Centers United to come speak to this issue.
Thanks, Mike. So first I want to thank Representative Regenberg, Senator Golden, and Representative Williams for their leadership on this issue. What an inspiring coalition, an inspiring group of people that we've built. This is an issue whose time has come. An entire classification of the workforce should not be left out of earning a fair minimum wage. The sub-minimum wage for tipped workers of $2.89 creates poverty and it creates inequality. It's justified based on a myth that tipped workers are earning so much, servers, bussers, runners, and bartenders earn so much in tips that it more than makes up for the fact that they earn a base wage of just $2.89 an hour. For the vast majority, that's just not true. Tipped workers live in poverty at nearly 2 times the rate of the rest of the workforce here in Rhode Island and rely on food stamps at double the rate. Now think about that for a second. That means that the people that put food on our tables in restaurants often can't afford to put food on their tables at home. Now, because the vast majority of tipped workers are women, about 70%, this poverty burden falls on them. The sub-minimum wage for tipped workers is in effect a legislative pay inequity for a female workforce. Women who are mothers, many of them single mothers, and rely on tips that fluctuate based on shift, based on time of day, based on weather, to support themselves and their families. And it's not just an economic issue, because when you force a female workforce to rely on tips for their income, what they have to do is curry favor from customers in order to make a living. And what this does is exacerbates already the highest levels of sexual harassment in any industry. Because the customer's always right. So whatever inappropriate touches or comments the customer makes, the server has to put up with, because it's a choice between making a living and standing up for yourself. Now, there's a pretty easy solution to this. It's not a radical solution. It's something that's in existence in 7 states in the United States right now. One fair wage, the same minimum wage for all workers, tipped and non-tipped. Over 1 million workers on the entire West Coast and Nevada are already working under this system. And you know what? Not surprisingly, tipped workers are doing better. Lower poverty rates, lower gender wage gap, lower race wage gap. But you know what? Businesses are too. In these states where the minimum wage is the same for tipped and non-tipped workers, there's higher per capita sales in the restaurant industry, higher employment growth in the restaurant industry, and within the classification of tipped workers, and menu prices are not higher on average. It's time for one fair wage here in Rhode Island. It's time that all workers are guaranteed a fair minimum wage under the law. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.